Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Jonathan Ribner.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you all for coming today on this. Ooh, sounds like I'm going to be like Jimi Hendrix. Okay. Thanks for coming on this gorgeous day to hear me talk about visual fundamentals as part of this course, Learning to See. Now, Learning to See is a course that I actually teach at Boston University, and it's really a course about enhancing your ability to see, and we're surrounded by visual things all the time, every day. Think about looking at your computer screen or at your phone, but what we're mostly getting is information, and it's really easy to overlook the visual richness that's out there. And I really pitch this course to people who are people who have taken art history, enjoy it, but also to people who've never had exposure to it, especially people who are headed for the medical field or engineering or even management. But it's a course that really is, in many ways, not an art history course. I tell the students that they'll get pieces of art history, and you'll get some today too. I mean, I'm an art historian, and so it's hard for me not to do art history, but I'm going to show you things that I would never show anyone in one of my regular art history courses. Well, the first thing I want to show you, actually, let's see if I can go here, are the illustrations to a children's book by someone named Istvan Banyai, and it was published in 1995. It's called Zoom. And what you want to do here is just look closely, and I'm going to move the slides by fairly rapidly and see if you can figure out what's going on, because it's really about taking a new look, thinking outside of the box, and maybe getting the big picture. So what do we have here? It looks a little bit like an abstract painting or something like that, but it's really part of a rooster. So there's a lot of things there. Well, this may look like an awful lot of Christmas decorations. My son went to Georgia Tech, and so one time when I was visiting, he and his then fiance, now his wife, took me to Buckhead, which is a kind of affluent suburb of Atlanta. And because they knew that at this house, every year at Christmas time, they go all out. And why would I be showing you something like this? Well, for one thing, it may look like really bad taste to you, but art is in the eye of the beholder. And the other thing is that if you look at these things, well, it seems like absolute excess, but they all have something in common. They're all inflatable. In other words, a decision has been made here, a kind of a restriction of possibilities, a limitation, as it were. And if you think about this as art, well, it's sort of stretching the term, but there clearly was a kind of necessity, a kind of an intensity about the collecting of these things. And collecting is one of the things that we'll be talking about in a future lecture. But there is something about art, not just art collecting, but art making, which seems to be that we're hardwired for. It's a little bit like sports and music and religion. You know, if you try to repress it, it comes out in another form, and this is a pretty interesting form. But this idea of limitation is something that you really need in a work of art. Otherwise, it's a little bit like having a tennis game without a net or without rules. It gets boring really fast. And limitation can be an exciting thing, actually. I mean, think about black and white photos. I'll show you some today. It doesn't mean that they're any worse than color photos or not as interesting. It's a certain kind of limitation that can actually make something exciting. Or think about when artists get older, that they begin to sometimes lose the ability to see as clearly or to use their hands as without shaking. And so you have somebody like a Monet or a Degas or a Cézanne who clearly had serious eye problems. We know that. But that doesn't mean that their later work is any worse than their earlier work. It was a limitation that in some ways could make things very exciting. Maybe we wouldn't have the water lilies otherwise. Well, we talk about art, and we talk about media, think about painting, sculpting, drawing, but there's a lot of different ways that people can make art. And here's a rather imaginative one. This is by an artist named Deborah Sperber called After the Mona Lisa 1, 2005. And you may not be able to see it very clearly, but there's a kind of acrylic or glass ball here. And there is a sort of postage stamp size image of the Mona Lisa. Well, it's taking in that image from what you have behind it, which are a whole bunch of spools of thread that have been hung on beaded chains. And it's the Mona Lisa upside down, sort of in giant pixels. It's kind of a remarkable kind of conception. And if you think about it in relation to the Mona Lisa, and this is something, again, that we'll talk about in one of the future lectures. I mean, the Mona Lisa, of course, is an absolute superstar. When you go to the Louvre, they have signs everywhere to La Joconde, to the Mona Lisa. And if you want to go in that room, you have to kind of stand like this, with the bulletproof glass and all the barriers. And you wonder, what is going on here? Why are these people crowding into this room and not looking at anything else around them? Where there's the Madonna of the Rocks, for example, not too far away. But art often has to do, in fact, it seems to always have to do in some ways with, except maybe in the, the earliest dawn of mankind, with other art, with imitation. So this is really art that really has to do with something that already exists and is very famous. Now, one of the things that I like to do at the beginning of this course is to talk about things that we see every day, things that don't get noticed. So it's really a class that I call noticing. And what I'm going to show you are some things that are very easy to overlook. For example, this utility cap here for water, what's the big deal? Well, somebody, or maybe more than one person, took a lot of trouble to design this thing, to think about the letters, their placement. Think about how you have basically a symmetrical word here, all pivoting on the T, and how the T is integrated or relates very clearly to this grid pattern, this sort of circular grid pattern. And you begin to realize that there actually is something maybe worth looking at. Well, that's what whoever designed these manhole covers in Budapest thought. They thought this would be a good occasion for bringing some art into your life. They really are pretty remarkable. We don't have anything quite like that in Boston, but we do have things like this, which seem to be just completely accidental, like this manhole cover, that somehow, with this grid pattern and then these letters that are just kind of floating around, I thought made a really interesting, was a really interesting relationship here to these bricks, this sort of unfinished work. This is out, over by the BU Fit Rec Center where they've been building a bicycle path for eternity. Or it's been going on for eternity, that is. But anyway, things like that, or something like this, where you have, it's basically, the outside of a restaurant where you have one of those little patio enclosures. And I thought it made a kind of interesting comparison to this painting. This is actually by a Hungarian painter who taught at the Bauhaus, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. It's a painting called A2 from 1924, that in some ways, and clearly this is completely accidental, nobody arranged this thing to make it look like a painting, but in some ways, in thinking about this, I was reminded of something that Oscar Wilde said, which was that nature imitates art. Meaning that we don't see things in nature often. I mean, this isn't really nature, you could say. It's something that's very much artificial or man-made, but we somehow don't see things there unless we've seen them in art. For example, the way that when you go out in the snow in the afternoon and you see that the shadows are blue, well, you especially notice that because you've seen paintings by Monet. We'll see one of those later on, and so that really becomes a kind of a whole area for discovery. And very ordinary things can take on a really unusual aspect if they're seen with an artistic eye. So this pepper by Edward Weston, when I show it to my class, generally I don't include the label because I want to see if they can figure out what it is. And it often, somebody always guesses that it's a pepper, but there always are a few people who aren't quite sure what it is. It looks kind of like a flexed muscle or something like that. But partly from the point of view, and that point of view is something we'll be talking about, but also the remarkable lighting. It has something to do with scale, which we'll talk about as well, but this lighting, which really creates this extraordinary object. I mean, it suddenly becomes dramatic. I mean, what could be less dramatic than a vegetable? But somehow it manages to do that. And so the first thing I really want to talk about with this visual fundamentals lecture, and in some ways what I'm also thinking about here is if you ever have taken a course in design, like the courses I had to take when I was in college. I mean, it was part of the art history major, but I really love these courses where you study things like, light and shade and color and composition. One of the most fundamental of the fundamentals in some ways is light. We can't see without light. The whole idea of, making sense of things visually, we don't see without light. And sometimes, if we get our coordinates mixed up, things can be very disconcerting in regard to light. So this is a painting by the Belgian surrealist René Magritte called The Empire of Light 2, and it's quite late. It's much really after most of surrealism happened. It's really a movement mostly of the 1920s and 30s. But in this painting here, something very strange is going on. I mean, Magritte loves to put things together that don't belong together. There's the famous one with the pipe where it says, "This is not a pipe," that kind of thing. So in this one, it's nighttime and day at the same time, which is really kind of remarkable. One of the things that happens at night or in the evening is that you can see here is that all of the values or the tones, the lights and darks, get very close to each other, so it gets to be very difficult to distinguish things. That's one of the reasons why, when you're driving, you have to be extra careful at twilight. I mean, not to mention at night, to not, for pedestrians and bicyclists, because things just don't have that kind of definition. You can also have light become the medium itself in many ways. And some of you may remember that it was quite a few years ago, I guess. I kind of lose time. I mean, when I started losing my hair, I sort of lost that sense of, how long ago things happened, along with forgetting everyone's names and things like that. But this work by Tim Noble and Sue Webster called Real Life is Rubbish, I was really puzzled when I first saw it, because the first thing I noticed, I saw these shadows, because there was a light projecting, and then I saw this rubbish, these piles of sort of, these constructions of sort of fastened together pieces of wood, a can of Brasso. I mean, what are all these things? And then you realize that they actually are the images, the silhouettes are actually being projected with the light hitting those things. It's a little bit like going like this and making a dog, but considerably more complicated, a kind of self-portrait, as it were, in light and dark. And if you go up into the galleries upstairs, the galleries that have to do with the Dutch Republic from the 17th century, you'll see this remarkable painting by Rembrandt, which I've really used as sort of the poster child of this whole lecture series, an artist in his studio. Now, if you know the painting, you'll know that it's actually quite small. It's really a very small painting. But when you see it on the screen like this, you would never guess that, because it has a sense of what we could call monumentality. It has an incredible presence. And that presence really has to do with the handling of light and shade. This very subtle kind of transitioning from light to dark that Rembrandt is so famous for. I mean, he creates these sort of magical scenes that have to do with light and dark. So that the painter, who really seems rather small in some ways compared to the painting on the easel, he seems to be almost in awe of the light that's emanating from this canvas, which is really quite remarkable, so that even though the setting is very humble, you can see cracks in the plaster, these sort of rough floorboards, the whole thing takes on an exalted aspect, as if you're in the presence of something sacred. And there's also something about that 17th century Dutch Republic that had artists, that gave us artists that were acutely sensitive to changes in light and shade. And of course, the whole ability to convey that in paint was, in some ways, is not completely possible without oil paint. And it was in the north, especially in the area that we now call Belgium, that we really, the northern Europe, that we really got the invention of oil paint in the 15th century. So, with oil, of course, you can get these very, very subtle kinds of changes. Oil dries very slowly, and you can get effects. Well, I certainly couldn't, but Vermeer could, like this, which is really magical. And maybe one of the things that makes this painting so magical is the way that she is looking at us, but we are drawn to look at her in detail in this kind of extraordinary richness in terms of changing light and shade, the kinds of transitions over here by her shoulder or the turban or her face, which are done very, very subtly, very carefully. There also is in this painting a full play with reflection, which is another aspect of light and dark. So you have the sort of triple reflections here of the famous pearl earring, but also her lips and her eyes, which that reflection really giving you a very different kind of light experience than the clothes, the more sort of matte clothing that you see around her. So this kind of effect, it also has to do with contrast, the fact that we're looking at something that's illuminated against something that's very dark. And of course, that kind of contrast really sets we could say it sets her into relief. It really brings salience to her. And that's really a very typical convention in portraiture, that you have the face illuminated, but then you have the background dark in order to bring out this quality. And so that we're really talking about something, this sort of play of light and dark, we sometimes use this Italian term, chiaroscuro, the sort of light-dark alternation that we have here. Another term for it is modeling, when we talk about modeling in light and shade, because when you have, and that suggests something three-dimensional, because when you have something moving in a kind of a slow transition like this, it suggests three dimensions. There's something about the way that our brains work that we see it that way, but it really is a convention. And I remember once reading in a book called, I think it's called Art and Nature, by Joyce Carey, who was a British novelist of the 20th century, and he also painted. And he talks about a situation where he showed a portrait, just a kind of standard portrait, nothing special, to someone who I think was actually from either from India or, in any case, had never really seen a lot of Western portraits. And the response of the person that he showed the portrait to was, well, that's very nice, but why is half of her face dirty? Which is kind of interesting because it really suggests that what we're seeing is a convention. Now, when we talk about light and dark, which is this sort of basic fundamental building block, we're talking about value. And there are really two technical terms for value, or there's for light and dark. One of them is value, and the other one is tone, and they really mean the same thing. The only difference is that you can only use value as a noun. Tone you can use as a noun, or you can make it an adjective by saying tonal, but they really have to do with dark and light. And what I'm showing you here is a scale of values. So what you have here is that you're moving from white to black. With all of these intermediary steps. So it's a little bit like a musical scale, but instead of do, re, mi, you have white, gray, grayer, grayer, black. And one of the things that I have the students do in the early part of this course is to try to make a scale like this, just using like a number 2 pencil and rubbing. And the whole point is that it's actually quite difficult, because if you make the squares too close, well, then they just blend together. If you make too abrupt a jump, well, then the whole thing breaks, and it doesn't really work. And an artist like a Rembrandt or a Vermeer, I mean, these were absolute masters at this kind of careful, slow use of the value scale. Now, one of the things about values, this is very different from what we'll see, what we call hue, and that's the technical term for what we usually call it color. So red is a hue, blue is a hue, yellow is a hue. And values, this goes back to what I said about limitations. It used to be, when we had TVs, when I was a kid, of course, they were all black and white TVs, and you had your darkness or lightness switch, and that just would give you values. And if you remember, like the kind of cartoon that was being produced around that time, say go back to, I don't know, the 50s or 60s, you get something like Fantasia. And that's a very bright, colorful thing. It's full of hues, but it was done in a period when people were very aware of value, so that it has all these scenes with torches, with shadows. You don't get that anymore in cartoons. They're all about hue. In other words, they're all like, violets and reds and yellows. But there was something about, or think about those Hitchcock films with shadows, or Humphrey Bogart films. You would never want to get rid of those black and white things. That's why I've always thought that colorizing films is an act of vandalism, because it completely takes that away. Well, one of the things that we'll be seeing in next week's lecture, that's going to be called It's All Relative. We're going to be learning about some things that are relative, and value or tone is also relative. In other words, if you see something that's dark next to something, if you see something light next to something dark, it might seem lighter, and vice versa. And this is an interesting demonstration of that. So what we have here, it looks kind of like an H that's been stretched out. And you can see behind it, there is a kind of value scale. So that here, going from light gradually into dark. And when you look at this thing, it's a kind of optical illusion. It looks like this part of the H is lighter than this part. Doesn't it look darker? But it's not. It's all the same. You're really just seeing something that, in terms of relationship to what you're seeing in the back, it actually changes. Now, there are some useful terms when we're talking about value. This is a wonderful photograph. It's a photograph of a little construction with feathers that have been put into a white box. It's a little hard to see in the slide, but there's a little sort of a white box, like a frame around it. It's by an artist named Catherine Alling, Feathers number 22 from 1984. And this really shows you in the kind of gradation of light and dark, it's a good example of what we call local values. So local values are there's a kind of directness there. In other words, what you would see under regular lighting, a kind of medium lighting, you would get this kind of contrast between light and dark. And there's something really special about it. It always reminds me a little of a yin and a yang, the way the things sort of wrap around like that. And it's just this, and this is something made by someone who really knew how to see. I mean, how often do we see feathers? But putting it together in this way really is kind of remarkable. Now, if those are local values, in other words, darks and lights that are seen under somewhat, everyday or not extreme conditions, this is what we call interpretive value. Now, this is a famous photograph by the American photographer Edward Steichen called Rodin the Thinker, and here is Rodin himself, and it's very much an image of genius, the idea of Rodin looking at the thinker, which is really, it's really him. I mean, he is the thinker, he's thinking about the thinker, and of course, if you go out to Meudon, which was the town where Rodin had his studio, there's actually 2 Rodin museums in France. There's the famous one that I'm sure many of you have been to in Paris, which is really magnificent. And there's another one, which I have to admit I've never been to, in Meudon, which is sort of halfway out to Versailles. Apparently, you have to be very careful of the opening hours. But in any case, that's where he's buried next to his wife. And the thinker is there, overlooking him. And of course, the thinker is one of his most famous sculptures. So here is the thinker. And then behind, here in plaster is the monument to Victor Hugo, which I don't think was ever completed in its, in its final form. And Victor Hugo, of course, was this absolutely monumental genius. I mean, Jean Cocteau put it very well when he said, Victor Hugo was a madman who thought he was Victor Hugo. And, behind him, and, this kind of cloudy, it's like ectoplasm or something behind Rodin, who cuts this sharp silhouette. And you think about how value or light and dark is being treated in this photograph in lots of different ways. It's a great variety from the sort of flat black that you see here, and then maybe here as well to the reflections on the statue, and then this kind of ghostly ectoplasm like Victor Hugo that you see in the back. Now, of course, Steichen was part of a movement in photography that we call pictorialism, photographers from around the turn of the century who wanted to give their photographs a kind of arty quality so that it's not just a mechanical tool, a way of remembering things, but rather a work of art in itself. And that was always, especially in the 19th century at least, that was an issue surrounding photography. Is it really art? This really shows somebody who wanted to believe that. But one of the ways that they're doing this is by looking at the world, as it were, through a kind of scrim, a kind of a screen that makes everything have this really extraordinary quality. Now, right here in the museum, you can see these 2 portraits, which together really tell us something about the handling of light and dark, of modeling in different times and with different artists. So on the left, we have this really striking portrait of Victorine Meurent, who, of course, from the early 1860s. And Meurent, of course, was Manet's favorite model. I'm sure many of you know Olympia, that she posed for Olympia. She's also the woman with the guitar coming out of the cafe that you can see in the same gallery upstairs. She is the woman in the Luncheon on the Grass. I mean, she really was in a lot of Manet's most famous paintings, but here just simply a kind of bust-length, excuse me, portrait. And what I'm comparing it with is a remarkable early work by Velázquez. It's of a poet whose name was Louis de Góngora y Argote, from 1622. He doesn't look like a very nice man. I certainly would, and there's something about that nose. It looks like, maybe somebody gave him a good punch when he was younger, but there's something very hard-bitten about it, but remarkably specific. And this is one of the qualities of what we could call 17th century Spanish realism. And I'm thinking of, very much of someone like Velázquez or Zurbarán or Ribera. It's not just that it's realistic, but it's specific. It's a specific nose. It is something that he really has gotten to know all of this. And the idea of realism as warts and all. Here you have this sort of birthmark over here. But the way that light and dark is handled is very, very different in the two paintings. So to bring out all of those sort of features, the sort of craggy features of this face, Velázquez has very powerfully modeled it. There are these strong darks, there are strong lights, but the transition between them in many ways is something that really tells you, it's gradual enough that it tells you that this is powerfully three-dimensional. When you're looking at the Manet, the contrast between the illumination of her face here and then the side of her face here is rather abrupt. And what that tends to do is that it flattens out. And Manet liked that kind of flat look. I mean, for one thing, he admired flatness in Japanese prints, and he didn't really want to fool your eye into thinking that this was a really three-dimensional face. That's what much more conventional artists did, who tended to be much more sentimental. Artists who he would see with their works hanging in the salon, the official exhibition that they had in Paris. And so there's a real difference here. What you get in this Velázquez is, in a sense, a more complete use of that value scale of tone, so going the whole gamut from very dark to very light. And you can see also that in the background, he alternates the really dark side on the left that goes with the illumination here, on his right, our left, and then over here, the lighter going with the dark. And of course, just like that stretched out H that I showed you, that's really going to throw the whole thing into relief. Whereas Victorine Meurent, it's a much flatter kind of thing. It's a much more two-dimensional thing. In fact, the painter Gustave Courbet, who really in many ways painted much more like this, when he saw Manet's painting of Olympia, he said, why, it's the Queen of Spades stepped out of the bath, meaning that it was flat as a playing card. There also is a kind of flatness of emotional expression here. In other words, you don't really get that much sense of inner life. With Manet, I like to, he was a great still life painter, and I like to think that in Manet, the humans are still life objects as well. It's kind of still life with human. Whereas in Velázquez, there really is a sense here in some ways of inner life, to the point where I would say he doesn't look like a very pleasant fellow. You'd never get that kind of a thing from Manet. Also notice the stripes, that go along with this cord, this necklace, the cord around her neck. But those stripes, in some ways, are a play on the kind of shadow that you would, in a more traditional painting, you would get along the edges. This is the kind of thing that Manet sometimes does to sort of kill the shadow. I mean, I'm sure many of you know that famous painting of the boy playing a fife. Well, if you go to the trousers, to the spot where you have the most shadow, you have a black stripe on the pants, and so it just kills the shadow. It's a curious kind of thing. Now, now jumping back to the 17th century, first, a painting on the left by Vermeer, so a northern, painting from the Dutch Republic. On the left, it's called The Art of Painting in Vienna, the Kunsthistorisches Museum. And then over here, an Italian Baroque, an early Italian Baroque painting by Caravaggio of the Conversion of St. Paul. I'm sure some of you know these two. They're very famous paintings. And, there's a lot that could be said about these two. I mean, north versus south. Things like that. But I'm really thinking about them especially in this context in terms of light. When you're looking at the Vermeer, I mean, just like that girl with the pearl earring, there's something very magical about that lighting. It has something very gentle and subtle about it. But you can tell that even though there's a curtain here, and the curtain blocks the window or wherever the light is coming from, you can easily imagine that behind that curtain, there must be a window which is shedding light in this way. So you could say it's a painting that has natural lighting. The lighting in the Caravaggio is completely unnatural. It's miraculous. The whole idea is that a miracle is taking place, a kind of out-of-body experience, an ecstasy. on the part of St. Paul, you know, who originally is Saul, and he's going on his way to Damascus with the intention of persecuting Christians, but he has this vision, and then he becomes St. Paul. And what Caravaggio is doing here, and this is very typical, so much to the point that we call this kind of lighting Caravaggesque lighting. It's a kind of extreme use of chiaroscuro, where you have boldly illuminated figures, at least boldly illuminated in patches, and then very dark, impenetrable darkness in the back, thick darkness. And this does a couple of things. For one thing, it really heightens this sense of miraculousness, because how could you possibly have this kind of lighting? Well, I guess you could have a very intense torch over here, but it just doesn't seem to work the way that we know that light and dark works in the way that, say, the Vermeer functions. It's also a painting which, because of its miraculousness, is really intended to incite your piety. I mean, this is the kind of thing where it's very much what we call a counter-Reformation image. That is, that it's a painting which was done sometime after the Protestant Reformation started, you know, with Luther. And the idea here is it really is intended to be a powerfully persuasive thing. It's like, you think you're going to be a Protestant? I don't think so. We're going to show you this. And not only does it engage you, and this is something that we'll see when we talk about sculpture as well, it not only does it engage you in terms of the light and the dark and the sense of realism. I mean, this was one of the things that I think astonished people at the time with Caravaggio, that you could have something that was so startlingly realistic, so that you could have kind of ordinary types here, like this man who looks like he's a groom for the horse or something like that, or a servant with that wrinkled forehead. That kind of thing was really astonishing, but it also is going to grab you because of the foreshortening of the figure. And this is something that we'll talk about later. Foreshortening has to do with seeing things in 3 dimensions when they tend to be perpendicular to what we call the picture plane, and we'll see this in a moment. And it's the kind of situation that when you're, you know, having those irritating 3D glasses in a movie, the things that feel like they're going to jump out at you, you know, that's a kind of those foreshortened things. So my arm is now foreshortened when you're looking at it, much less so when you see it like that. Well, that kind of, that sort of aggressive engagement of the viewer really brings us into a very Baroque kind of space, and we'll talk about this more later. In many ways, the Vermeer is really operating, even though it's a Baroque painting, is really operating according to that Renaissance idea that the painting is a window, that you're kind of looking through a window, whereas in the Caravaggio, it's as if it's a door, and the whole thing is coming out at you in this very aggressive way. Now, foreshortening is something that we can also associate with great draftsmanship, great drawing, like this, for example, this sheet of studies by Michelangelo for the Sistine Chapel. And the reason why I wanted to show you a couple of different varieties of drawing. I mean, drawing is a kind of medium which has to do with, you could say, a way of making art, which has to do with light and dark in many ways. I mean, it is and not only in terms of the way that it's modeled, that is, you know, the shading along the limbs here, but also the way that what we call the exterior contours are handled. So if you look at this arm, you'll notice that as we get near the elbow, it gets much thinner or lighter. You could say that the weight of the line, the weight of the exterior contour is changing. And that gives you a lot of information about the solidity, or the volume, the mass of the arm. In other words, just by changing that line, and somebody like Michelangelo is a great, you know, one of the greatest of all time, great master of this. And I like to think about the ability to change those exterior contours as being analogous to the fingers of a great pianist like a Lang Lang, or a, you know, a cellist like Yo-Yo Ma. You know, that somehow that pressure changing can change the whole thing, such that you can listen to two recordings by very competent musicians who are all following the right notes, but one of them is different. One of them is somehow much more special, and it has in part something to do with that sort of magical ability to do that. Now, this kind of drawing, which is really has to do with these very firm exterior contours on the one hand, and then this subtle modeling, this chiaroscuro, the Italians gave that a special name, disegno. And that tradition of Italian, what we could call Central Italian drawing, when I say Central Italy, we're talking about, say, Rome and Florence. That's the tradition of Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci. That's in many ways what came to be called drawing. I mean, that sort of becomes the normative kind of drawing that you are taught, say, in an art school. And one of the reasons why that came to be is that in the 16th century, the French king, Francis I, François Ier, brought a whole group of these Italians, including Leonardo da Vinci, who supposedly died in his arms. He brought them to France, to Fontainebleau, to his palace, and they perpetuated or established this tradition of drawing in France. And that's the reason why, say, in the 18th and 19th centuries, France was the place to go to study drawing. I mean, to the point where people from all over the world went there. I mean, it's a little bit like with sports, how certain countries have certain sports. I mean, if you want to study basketball, obviously you come to the United States, but if it's equestrian sports, maybe you'll go to England. You know, they're going to have the best coaches and the best tradition, and somehow France becomes the place to do drawing. But this isn't the only way to draw and to work with light and shade. Here's a remarkable self-portrait with pencil by the German expressionist Kathy Kollwitz from 1933. And you can see right away that it looks nothing like the Michelangelo. It really has a completely different way of thinking about light and dark and thinking about contour. I mean, the contours themselves are more suggested than firmly incised, like we saw with the Michelangelo. It also has a very expressive quality, and we call Kathy Kollwitz an expressionist. I mean, someone who really heightens the emotional expression of things, generally through some kind of distortion, through exaggerations. This one, in this case, not so distorted. It really doesn't seem that. In fact, it seems quite realistic, but which does have this very expressive use of the chalk here. And one of the things I love about this drawing is that on the one hand, it shows her drawing. It's a self-portrait, after all, with pencil, but it also shows the marks of her drawing. In other words, she's drawing this portrait about drawing in a way that you can really have this sense of the hand moving with the chalk as she actually created this work. It also has a certain kind of economy, that is, getting the most out of the least. And economy is another topic I want to talk about. We can turn to Rembrandt, to this famous drawing of a sleeping girl, to really see a wonderful example of economy. So when we're talking about economy in art, excuse me, it's a little bit like talking about economy with money. I mean, with economy with money, how do you get the most for your dollar? You know, how do you get your most for your money? And with art, it's how can you do the most things with the least amount of marks or color or whatever. And that's what Rembrandt does here. I mean, it really is done sort of miraculously with really relatively few strokes of, it looks like maybe a reed pen or a brush. And he really creates this very persuasive image of this sleeping figure. I mean, even in, very economically shading in just a little bit of the back that suggests perhaps that it's dark while she's sleeping, leaving a lot of it just blank paper. But that blankness takes on a shape quality, really experience that not just as emptiness, but as part of the sleeping the part of the sleeping figure. Notice also how he varies the emphasis, the weight. Again, it's a little bit like what I showed you with the Michelangelo, varying the weight of those strokes, of the marks that he makes here on the paper. And that really tells us a lot, so that, for example, he wants to give us some extra emphasis to the shoulder here by making this darker. And, you know, it really is, it's a really astonishing kind of thing. Well, here's another way of dealing with economy. And I'm sorry this is a little bit cut off here. There's actually another leg. This by a, this graphic artist, Shigeo Fukuda, excuse me, called Legs of Different Genders. And you can see if you follow this thing that here are the different genders. This is the male leg. This is the female leg down here. But it's extremely economical because it's almost like an optical illusion, because the same contours, the exterior contours for each leg is used for the other leg as well. And so it's a really clever thing. There's another concept that comes into play here, and it has to do with negative space. So we talk about, we're talking about shapes here, and negative space is the space around the shape, or it's everywhere that you don't really see the solid thing that's being represented. But in this case, there really is no negative space, because the negative space becomes positive space. It becomes positive shape, that is. It's a really clever kind of play with that concept. So in a way, you don't really get to negative space until the two ends of the image. You know, up here you can say, well, the soles of the shoes are surrounded here by negative space, or the soles of the shoes here by this dark negative space. But it's what you can see is that this artist has really made the negative space have a positive shape quality. And this is something that a lot of great artists do. Matisse, for example, when he does those wonderful cutouts, you know, of shapes on paper, you could, you know, look at the white paper as well as the blue nude or whatever he has on there, and you'll see that it has a very positive kind of quality. There's another way of dealing with economy, and I couldn't resist bringing this because of course, the contemporary show downstairs. And not only is it a very economical image because of these simple shapes, and of course, this was a style that Toulouse-Lautrec really made his name with around 1893 with the poster of Jean Avril, you know, the can-can dancer, that somehow these were perfectly adopted to, you know, those kiosks that they have in Paris, those things that look kind of like cylinders with little roofs or like little umbrella things, because these posters like this one for Aristide Bruant would be plastered on these curved surfaces, and they'd be perfect for taking in the information as you went by, as you were walking or maybe going by in a carriage. It's very direct. And to get something like that that's so immediately apprehensible or comprehended, you have to have a certain kind of simplification, a certain kind of economy. But there's something else as well. It has to do with these trademark pieces of clothing: the red scarf, the black cloak, the black hat, the walking stick. These are the trademarks of the person himself. And this is a little bit like, you know, later on in the 1960s when Andy Warhol does images of Marilyn Monroe and, you know, does the eye makeup and the lips. So the lips become a kind of economical trademark of Marilyn Monroe, to the point where he just did a whole lot of lips, nothing else. That's something that you could see going on here. And in some ways, there's a similarity because both Warhol and Toulouse-Lautrec were interested in celebrities, in popular entertainment, popular culture. There's also the economical effect of having the words here be very close to the background, so, or the face very close to the background in a way that really it's very legible and at the same time very economical. Of course, you have this very strong contrast as well of the black and the red, you know, picked up again here, or the black of the hat, which is really very striking. And in terms of shapes, notice the kind of cousin shapes of the hair and the scarf, and then this fold or this hem of the cape. I mean, there's a sort of family of shapes here. Well, another concept I want to talk about is scale. This may be a little surprising because it seems like such an ordinary image. A photograph by Mark Cohen taken in August of 1970, simply called Dog. But of course, one of the things that's a little bit unsettling about this photograph is how incredibly big that dog looks. Like it's kind of the dog that ate Chicago. But it really has to do, for one thing, with point of view, and that's something that we'll be getting back to. A little bit later. Scale, of course, isn't the same as size. Scale does involve size, but it's a relationship between one thing of one size and something of another, like the scale of a map. You have the size of the United States out there, and then you have the size of your map, and there's a relationship. And when we're looking at works of art, the reference that we have is ourselves, our own size that we're looking at it. Or in this case, the reference is to the houses and the car. So the dog really looms up in relation to those two things. And so this is a good example of a photographer who knows how to see, a photographer who, in a sense, has absorbed the lessons of learning to see, who can see something that's very, very ordinary. I mean, what could be more ordinary than this? But seen from an unusual point of view that creates these scale disparities, or this very startling kind of scale. It really becomes kind of magical. And of course, one of the things about photography, of course, is that it involves sometimes these very direct choices about something that if you described it would sound very, very simple. But that choice in itself, and of course you can do other things. You can crop, you can change the focus, the depth of field, you can change the lights and the darks and all of that. Those are choices as well. But in this case, of course, having to do in part with scale. Now, scale in terms of relationships can also have some very interesting aspects if we're talking about religious art. And in this particular case, we have by Jan van Eyck, a Netherlandish painter, so working in the area that's now Belgium, back in the 15th century, did this wonderful painting of the Madonna holding the Christ child in a Gothic church. It's all very meticulously painted, using tiny brushes, incredibly patient, working out the whole thing very carefully. And the idea that the Madonna is standing in a church and she's this tall, because you can imagine this church, maybe a person would be like down here or something like that. That really goes along with a very traditional way of thinking about representing the Madonna. In other words, in Christian paintings, going back centuries, you can make something bigger, like the Madonna or the Christ child, in accord with their importance and their holiness. So in other words, size or relative size really denotes importance and sacredness. And so that's what you're dealing with here, the idea that the Madonna would be in this church. There's also the metaphor of light coming through the windows that an art historian, Millard Meese, famously talked about as a metaphor for the virginity of the Virgin. In other words, the light can go through the window and not damage the window and can illuminate the Virgin in this way. Now, that all sounds pretty standard, but if you actually go to Berlin, to the Gemäldegalerie Gallery, and look at this painting, you realize that it's this big. It's a little tiny thing. It's a little jewel. So in other words, this gigantic Virgin is actually tiny, so that the scale relationship here that's so startling also has this aspect of being, being really amazing in the sense that we are looking at something that's so incredible. incredibly tiny. Now, what that also reminds us is that an artist like Jan van Eyck was very familiar with manuscript illumination, and manuscript illumination tends to be very small. I mean, if you go to the cloisters in New York, you can see the little Hours of Jean d'Evreux, a little tiny book with little tiny figures. That is a kind of preciousness that we have there, but it's a painting then, say a painting on wood that is, has some of those qualities. So we're really talking about something that's very tiny, but what if we look at something that's big? So this is a work by Claes Oldenburg and Koji van Bruggen called Spoon Bridge and Cherry, which is in Minneapolis in this park. And you can see it's really useful that we have some figures in the photograph. The figures give us the sense of scale. And you can see that it's an absolutely enormous thing. It's a really huge thing and very playful. I mean, very playful, just as is the giant clothespin in Philadelphia. Now, it's kind of interesting that in the Philadelphia Museum, you have the famous statue by Brancusi, The Kiss, which I think that he must have been thinking about when he did the clothespin. It's kind of a giant clothespin Brancusi. And I also wanted to show you this to suggest that some aspects, because I wanted to talk a little bit about sculpture, and some aspects about sculpture, in this case, a kind of compact mass. It's an example of what we call direct carving, when things have been carved away from the block directly by the artist, as opposed to, say, the work of Rodin. And Brancusi had started working in his studio early on, where it was done, the carving was done by assistants. I mean, a very different, and Rodin was a modeler. He really worked in soft, in clay, a very different kind of conception. But this idea of mass, of solidity, of volume, which is we often think of with sculpture, can also be subverted. And this, is, of course, is up in the American, the Art of the Americas wing, this delightful cow by Alexander Calder that doesn't really have, it's a sculpture, but it's a sculpture in wire. It's what we call a space drawing. It's a kind of drawing in space. And of course, he includes the cow poop. But it's a kind of negation in many ways of the solidity, the kind of three-dimensionality that you traditionally get in sculpture. Now, sculptors can work with space in some very creative ways. I mean, that's one. Another is the way that Picasso really invented assembled sculpture, assemblage, and it was a really monumental event in the history of art when he made things like the guitar. In other words, it's made by addition, not subtraction. If you think about, I mean, certainly clay you can add things to it, but if you're working in stone, you're really subtracting. This is addition, and you could use any kind of material, but it also is a work that really has relatively little solid mass. It's mostly about articulating space. Space comes in a different way in this work by Richard Serra. It's extremely minimal. I wouldn't really call him a minimalist simply because minimalism tends to not be quite as dramatic as this. This is dramatic, and what is being dramatized is the weight of this heavy metal that's just one piece sitting on another. I mean, this is kind of dangerous. You don't really want people getting too close to this. But the other thing I wanted to show you, and it's a little bit like a prime number. You can't take it down any further. It's just sort of weight. But it also, in these, these heavy materials, but it also interacts with space in a very interesting way, the way that it incorporates the corner here into the work. And this idea of a sculpture interacting with space can be done in a very aggressive way. I mean, the Serra has a real macho quality, but check this out, this giant X, which was put up in the Corcoran Gallery in 1967 by Ronald Bladen. It looks a little bit like a jumping jack or something, but it is absolutely dominating this space. I mean, it also makes an interesting kind of scale relationship with the whole thing. Or a work like this by Judy Pfaff called 3D, and it is very 3D. That is, it's a sculpture that you literally walk into. So it becomes a kind of three-dimensional work, which, and because of the color, it really has some of the aspect of a painting that you're walking into, even though it's sculpture. Well, another area that I want to get into, since we've been talking about space, is that. And what I wanted to just show you this for a moment, this really witty frontispiece by William Hogarth, who had a great sense of humor, to a book called Kirby's Perspective. So it's a kind of a frontispiece to a kind of textbook on how to do perspective, how to do space. And the more you look at this thing, you realize it's absolutely crazy that this man on a hillside is having his pipe lit by a woman with a candle here. The man over here is shooting the bridge. Everything is backwards. The cattle get bigger as they move away from you. The floor here is completely backwards in terms of the way that perspective would go. And of course, the fishing rod over here, I mean, there's even more things. The giant bird in the tree and things like that. All of these things completely impossible from the point of view of traditional perspective. Now, perspective, which was really one-point perspective in this case, was something that was invented in the Italian Renaissance in Florence by Filippo Brunelleschi. And I'll show you the kind of construction that he used. The effect is basically if you had a picture frame and you were looking down a railroad track, this is what you would call the picture plane, and then the point where it looks like the tracks meet and disappear, that is what we call the vanishing point. And of course, it's just a convention. You know, it's like the flat Earth thing. It's not really flat, just like the train tracks aren't really coming together, but it looks that way. Now, this is an actual perspective construction from the Renaissance, and you can see how it uses a human as the sort of scale, you know, the kind of standard here, and the top of the man's head here becomes where the vanishing point is. And you know, it's something that's kind of ingenious, that just like a lot of other things in the Renaissance are sort of mind-boggling that somebody came up with this, but it was a way of convincingly, you know, showing you how close to put, say, the floor tiles, and the way that it affected art. And this is, of course, it can really be seen with this comparison, this painting by Masaccio of the Madonna and Child, and then a much earlier painting that really predates the discovery of perspective by Cimabue. Cimabue was the teacher of Giotto, so that's really quite a bit earlier than this. And notice how, you know, and this is a good example of the giant virgin that I talked about, the little prophets down here, very different in size, and something that is similar here, the giant virgin with the little angels. But notice how the throne here looks like a real throne, how it really goes into space. And the little mandolins here, one goes into space and one comes out. The whole thing is really unthinkable without this discovery of perspective. And what we have here, this is a painting which really shows the full blooming of this discovery of perspective. This is what we could call a work from the High Renaissance by Raphael, the School of Athens. And it's so persuasive, not only in terms of the floor here, but also even this sort of running spiral. If you don't actually visit those rooms in the Vatican to see this, you wouldn't know that this is an illusion. This is actually flat, but it really looks like it's going into space. And the whole thing has a kind of harmoniousness that really goes along with the high-mindedness of the image, the idea of a dialogue here between Plato and Aristotle. And that spaciousness is so different from the claustrophobia. So this is an Italian, a southern image. This is a northern image by Hieronymus Bosch, the carrying of the cross, where we have Christ hemmed in on all sides by these grotesque figures. And there is this terrifying sense here of claustrophobia, but you can also get the opposite. You can get agoraphobia, which is the fear of open spaces, like in Munch's terrifying image, The Scream, where all of nature seems to be sort of warped in a kind of terrifying moment of anxiety. There also are spaces that are dream spaces, and that's a kind of metaphor that we get in surrealism, say that movement that I mentioned earlier of the 1920s and 30s. Salvador Dali is a great master of the dream space, as in this persistence of memory. The shadows, the modeling is all done very traditionally, but the space doesn't really make any sense. And of course, the things that have brought together don't make any sense at all. So it becomes a kind of space of dream. The whole painting is only about this big. So you can imagine it sort of inside your head, a kind of a dream postcard, as it were. You can also have, and here again connected to surrealism, a dream space that's made three-dimensionally, like this wonderful construction by Joseph Cornell, the American, really very idiosyncratic artist who created these kind of little portable dream spaces here with things, that he found and little bits and pieces of things. And there also is, for example, here, this is a traditional tokonoma alcove in a private home in Japan, the idea of a little space of peace and contemplation, a very different kind of thing, the sort of thing that you might find in a Japanese home. Now, another concept, and this really brings together a lot of the other concepts that I've been talking about, is composition. So composition is just the way that things are arranged, how they come together. And in this painting by Diego Rivera called Flower Day, it was a great favorite of Jackson Pollock because he grew up, he was from Wyoming, but he really grew up in LA, and that's where this painting was. He liked to look at this one. It's very symmetrical. And that really gives it a sense of solemnity and gravity. And if you want to see something that's asymmetrical, just go up in the galleries and look at the wonderful Carriage at the Races by Degas, which really has most of the action, as it were, crowded here into the lower right corner, and that also has this, and it really gives you this sense of something perhaps seen on the wing. It also has another aspect, which is cropping, the way that things are cut off to create these really interesting shapes that make it look almost like something seen through a camera viewfinder. And of course, this one, which was seen through a camera viewfinder, W. Eugene Smith's Saipan from World War II, really gives you a sense of how dramatic cropping can be, how it can really create a pretty spectacular sort of effect. You also have these chance things, or things that seem to be chance, that have to do in part with point of view, like this photograph by Henri Cartier-Bresson of this bicycle going by, and there's something about the relationship of the path of that bicycle with the line of the staircase that is really captivating. Or something seen from above, like this work by Janet Cummings Good called Floor Show, where the cats, seen from above, have this two-dimensional quality where they sort of look like puzzle pieces. And that idea of seeing things from, because we're really talking about point of view here, from unusual points of view, you can see also in this painting by Mary Cassatt, where we're looking up here in the blue room, the whole thing takes a kind of surprising sort of compositional aspect, really having to do with the point of view. This is something that we have very much in the work of Degas as well. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about color or hue, and I wanted to make the point right away that when we see colors in paint, we're talking about reflected pigments, okay? And when you have them all coming together, the three primaries, the red, yellow, and blue, the intersection of all of these things is really black or some kind of dark brown. That's really what you might expect. Things get very muddy when you get them all together. But if you have lights, like for example this red, blue, and green light, you get really, if they're refracted pigments, you get them all come together and they make white, which is really a surprising thing. There's also, it's really a metaphorical thing, the idea of temperature and color. And it's pretty straightforward that this is cool and this is hot. And hot colors tend to come forward more than others. And if you go up into the modern, I think it may be up right now, the contemporary wing. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry here, but you can see this painting by Ellsworth Kelly. And Kelly is a great color meister. He's a great balancer of colors. So you have the shape here. It all seems very direct and simple, this trapezoid. Because the hot color, the red, is much smaller than the blue, it really helps create a kind of balance. If you had it the other way, it really just wouldn't work. I mean, the red would just dominate in a way that's very different. If you go over in the room that has the Monet grain stacks, you'll see another kind of, you'll see a type of color that we could call atmospheric or ambient, where it seems to be a kind of dissolving of color in the atmosphere. And the colors here are very, very intense. And that's even the case when we have a winter scene with the blue, and I talked about the blue shadows before. And that concept of intensity, and this is another technical term, we also call it saturation or chroma. It has to do with the purity of the color. So here we have two opposites or complementaries, yellow and violet. And if we start blending them together, the center one, where it gets to be the most blended, is dull. And whereas in their complete purity, and this is just showing you how you can have values in color too, moving, if you add white or you add black, it takes away from the purity of the hue. But this idea of intensity, it's the sort of thing that really gets brought out when, say, Monet paints outside. He paints en plein air. And so it brings out these bright colors, complementary colors, reds and greens. And these really are what you could call the local colors, that is, the color of the thing itself, as opposed to what he shows you in the atmospheric color, where things tend to blur and blot. And become very atmospheric. Now, these colors, the reds and the greens, the blues, they're very high intensity. Here's an example of low intensity. This Russian painting by Isaac Levitan, Above Eternal Peace. And there is this sense here that somehow the colors themselves are peaceful. In other words, there's something expressive about the color that has to do with that lower, that sense of lower intensity. Now, color can be also something that's very much part of composition, so getting back to composition. And that's something you can see in this famous, really terrific painting. It's one of these things that you see so many times. It used to be, part of it was on the 100-franc bill, back when they had francs before the euro. But when you see it in person, it really is it's just a marvelous thing, Liberty Leading the People, from 1830 by Delacroix. And what you have here is a kind of triumph of liberty. I mean, she's wearing the Phrygian cap. That's the cap that was worn by liberated slaves in ancient Rome, carrying the French flag, the tricolored flag, which up to this point, before 1830, and that was the flag of the revolution, the flag of Napoleon's armies. But between those times, between the fall of Napoleon and 1830, that flag was banned because the kings had come back and they wanted their white flag with fleur-de-lis. So it's really a triumph. And so the colors of red, white, and blue are very important here, and they radiate throughout the painting. In other words, the whole color gamut of the painting really has to do with blue, white, and red. And the composition, of course, it's a great pyramid where the liberty holding that flag makes all of the bloodshed that you see there worthwhile, because it's coming up to this great meaning, to this great crescendo of liberty. So color can be very much part of a expressive aspect of a painting. It can also be symbolic. For example, upstairs, the famous Slave Ship by Turner, where he's really trying to bring out the horror, the cruelty of the slaves thrown overboard, the ill slaves, so that the captain, hoping that he could collect insurance money because they were baggage, considered baggage, horrible thing. It's based on a real story, but also on a poem from an 18th century poem. But the typhoon that's coming on, because the whole title is much longer than the slave ship, it has to do with it includes this reference to a typhoon. The blood red of the sky, it really has this sense of something that corresponds with the terrible deed that's taking place. And here is a a detail. And of course, Turner, I mean, Turner wasn't very good at painting figures. He was great, though, at painting atmosphere and color and moisture and things like that. And he really gives us a sense of that here. Another aspect, when we talk about a colorist, and Turner is definitely a colorist, as was Monet or Delacroix, we often are talking not just about their use of hue, that is their use of color, but their handling, the idea of leaving physical paint on the canvas, like you see here with, it looks like it was worked with a palette knife. Well, finally, I want to talk about two very different ways of using color expressively. By two artists, they knew each other. They weren't great friends. They're kind of friendly rivals. They respected each other's work, but they were really as different as night and day. That's Picasso and Matisse. In this painting, The Weeping Woman, which is really a postscript to Guernica, the great painting of 1937, it really has color being used. You could say it's a very expressive use of color, these very sharp contrasts of the red and the blue, for example, going along with the angularity of the figure, this figure, you know, biting her handkerchief, the tears like little beads coming out of the eyes. It's all very angular, but in some ways the color, even though it's not really realistic, it's being used in a way as local color, as that you could imagine a hat that's actually blue and red. Now, with Matisse, it's something altogether different. You can't imagine this is not local color at all. You can't imagine someone who really has a stripe of green and a stripe of lavender on her nose. I mean, that's really how it gets its name, the green stripe. And of course, Matisse never would have done something as disturbing as either this or Guernica. Matisse wanted a kind of art that would be like an easy chair for every mental worker, that showed the joy that he took in life. And in this case, the joy that he takes in looking at his wife. And the way that color is being used here in some ways is much more radical than what Picasso is doing. I mean, the Picasso is an incredibly powerful painting, but Matisse, who looks more kind of, well, it seems like maybe it's not so, you know, fireworks and all of that, is actually in some ways much more radical, because what he's doing here is he's taking the idea of light and shade, and which is value, and he's translating it into hue. In other words, it would be completely conventional if the half of her face was lit here, half of it was darker. Those are lights and darks. Say if you had flesh color that was lighter, flesh color that was darker. But what if instead of dark light, you have green pink? That kind of counterpoint is you're still going to be able to read that as a face. It's going to be much flatter, but it's also going to be much more vibrant, so that the stripe of lavender here is really like a stripe of lightness, but now translated into hue. And so that the whole thing takes on this kind of radiant, expressive quality, but a very different kind of, you know, you could say that they're both expressionistic or expressionist paintings, but very, very different kind of aspect. And this is just one of the one of the remarkable things that can be done with color. And next time we'll be looking at picking up some of the other leads that I mentioned this time, and I hope you can join us then. Thanks. If anybody has a question, if anyone has any questions, I can try to answer them. We have a microphone
on either side of the room, so if people do have questions, please.
There's a microphone over here. Just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Will you be talking in your next two classes about the relationship of the display of these items, specifically some of those three-dimensional sculptures, the big X or the jumping jack, for example, in the Corcoran?
That's a really good question. I think I will be doing that when I actually teach the course. The students have to do a paper, the first paper that they do that's exactly based on that, where they have to go to, I think it's the gallery in the Art of the Americans wing, you know, the one where they have the guitars and the sort of Art Deco stuff, and they have to just talk not really about the art itself, but about the display, about the, even everything from the lighting, the kinds of cases, is it something you can walk around, and how does that display relate to things like the scale, the size of the things, is it something that you really want to look, like that Jan van Eyck that I showed you, you can really get close to it. It's in behind glass, but you can really get, you wouldn't want to have that up on a wall. That's, you wouldn't really be able to see. So that's a really good question. And those kinds of decisions, which are really curatorial decisions, they really suggest that curators really also really have to know how to see and think about the art that they're showing that way. And it's something that also in merchandise, one of the things that I also do is I have the students go to Crate and Barrel and look at how things are shown there, the colors, the lighting, and they choose, they're very careful there. The stores, the individual stores don't have that much choice. I think the central committee, sort of decides how they're going to show things. And, that can be a really interesting part of, visual experience. So, does anyone else have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to ask you what you can say about the origin of chiaroscuro. Is it Caravaggio's Italy or is it Northern Europe? I've read conflicting stories about that.
That's a really good question. I mean, they're both I tend to associate it more with Italy simply because of the name, the word. But in Northern Europe, they were doing it as well. I guess and after, I don't really know. That's a really good question. I mean, it's one of these things that who knows? I mean, it could have been happening at the same place at the same time. I mean, that's the kind of, in different places rather at the same time. That happens in the history of art sometimes. I mean, in around 1962, Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein discovered they were both painting comic books. They didn't know that the other one was doing it, but the time was right. Just like in the 1860s when Monet was going outside and painting, other people were doing that. It's just sort of like the time had come, and I guess with chiaroscuro, I mean, in both cases, in both the North and in Italy, what you really had was a push to make art more lifelike. It was a way of making these religious stories come to life. And the light and dark treatment, the chiaroscuro, it was a kind of fundamental way to make things look more lifelike as opposed to, say, just flat, in medieval art, which tends to be much flatter. And of course, the discovery of perspective, that technology went along also. It was a way of making things more accessible, lifelike. I mean, you can go back to, Dante, writing the Inferno, the Divine Comedy in Italian, as opposed to in Latin. It's a way of making, that's part of what the Renaissance was about. But I mean, the whole thing is, it's, why did these things happen? What is it that brought, Raphael and Michelangelo and Leonardo, all these people working at the same time? It's ultimately a mystery. I mean, we can come up with things that have to do with patronage and, religion and things like that. But, ultimately, it's a kind of delightful mystery. Does anyone else have a? Oh, yeah.
I have a book that discusses color and value, and it's got a very interesting picture of Monet's Impression Sunrise, which has like a sun in the middle of it.
Right.
And if you take a black and white photo of that, the sun disappears. So he basically has made the sun basically, the same value as what's surrounding it.
Exactly, yeah. That's a really interesting thing. And when you make things very close in value, and Monet often does that, it acts as a kind of visual glue. It holds the whole thing together. And that's something that landscape painters, going back to the 17th century and beyond, they knew that as well. The thing that's really different with Monet is he's using this hue contrast in a way that's so powerful. And the way that you can really understand if an artist is really relying on hue rather than value is exactly that kind of effect. The question is, if you make a black and white photo of it, how much do you lose? So, for example, Matisse, you know, or Rothko, it would look like wet cotton or something. It just wouldn't do anything for you, or a Monet. I mean, we're so lucky now that we can have these digital images. It used to be that in art history books, most things, if not everything, were in black and white, really spoiled the way it is now. But that's a really good point. I think we might have time for one more. Does anyone have another question?
All right. Thank you so much for coming today. And thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you.